Edward Walsh stood in his kitchen and held his cup with both hands the way he always did when he needed to keep them steady. And he listened to his son tell him it was time to move out of the house he had lived in for 50 years. Marcus did not shout or slam a fist. He spoke like he did in board meetings, smooth and decisive. "Dad, maybe it's time you found your own place." And the words did not crash so much as settle over the room like a thin frost, coating the coffee pot, the sink, the map of pencil lines on the doorframe where a small boy had once demanded to be measured every birthday, and Edward, an elderly white man with neat silver hair and a calm face that hid more than it showed, nodded once and said, "I hear you," because he had learned long ago that a quiet answer kept your thoughts clear. Isabel, Marcus's wife, tugged open the refrigerator and reached for sparkling water, as if the conversation were only about groceries. And in a bright voice, she added that they needed space to grow as a couple, that a senior community would give Edward activities, friends his age, no stairs to worry about, meal plans that were so convenient. And she smiled a small, careful smile into the door shelves while her bracelets clicked together, then shut the fridge with her hip and leaned against the counter in her gym clothes. And Edward looked past them both to the backyard maple he had planted when Eleanor told him she was pregnant, the tree that had learned to lean toward the morning sun the way he had learned to lean toward every day's work. And he asked in a plain voice, "Where would you like me to go?" Which made Marcus glance at Isabel before listing 2 places they had toured, just in case. Sunrise Gardens and Willow Court, both with nice brochures and cheerful lobbies and tables set for 4 with napkins folded like swans. Edward said, "I see," and turned off the gas burner, because even in a shock he did not waste fuel. And he set the kettle aside and wiped a ring of water from the counter with the flat of his hand. And he said he would think about it, and he meant it, though not in the way they imagined. Then he walked down the hall that still smelled faintly of lemon oil and clean wood, and paused by the doorframe marks, his thumb tracing the notch labeled M8 and M12 and M17. And he felt, not anger, but a small door open inside him with a quiet click, the way a hidden compartment opens when you press the right part of an old desk. And he realized something simple and heavy at once. His son had begun to speak of him as a task, not a man. In the study, he closed the door and sat at the oak desk that Eleanor had insisted was too large but perfect. And he opened the bottom drawer and took out a red leather folder that still smelled like new leather, though it was older than Marcus's company. And he placed it on the blotter and opened it carefully, as if the hinges were a living thing. And inside were copies of deeds, a short trust instrument with his tidy signature, a letter from his attorney, and a 1-page note in Eleanor's rounded hand that he had read only twice in 5 years, because both times it bent his breath. "If they ever forget who you are, remember it for them." He set the note at the top and slid his reading glasses higher and checked the dates he already knew by heart. And he let the facts line up like tools on a bench. And while the house hummed with the soft sounds of morning, the refrigerator motor, the faraway thud of a neighbor's car door, he wrote a list in a narrow column, neat block letters, each task in the order it would need to be done. Call Lydia, verify title, call brokerage, private listing, confirm storage, pull shipping trunks, mark piano legs, sort books. And at the top of the page, he wrote 3 words because he liked rules that fit in the palm of the hand. Move with grace. When he stepped back into the hall, the rhythms of the house had not changed, and yet the air felt different, as if the house itself were waiting to hear what he would do. And Edward moved through the rooms slowly, not to say goodbye, not yet, but to inventory the work of decades with his eyes. The banister he and Eleanor had stripped and re-stained one winter weekend, while Marcus watched cartoons on the floor with a peanut butter sandwich. The living room window seat, where a feverish boy had slept on a summer night because the open sash gave him a breeze. The kitchen drawer that always stuck halfway. And he touched each thing because he liked to feel wood and metal and cloth. They were honest in the hand. In a way, words sometimes were not. Behind him, Isabel's voice floated from the kitchen about a designer she had found and how modern would make the rooms feel lighter. And Marcus said something about timelines and schedules. and Edward took the slow stairs to the second floor with the same measured pace he used every day. No pulling at the rail, no breathless steps. And in the bedroom, he smoothed the edge of the coverlet because Eleanor had liked a neat bed. And he pressed his palm for a moment to the cool glass of the framed lake painting above the dresser, remembering the thin rain and the low ducks that day. And then he returned to the study and wrote 2 names on 2 plain envelopes and left them unsealed on the corner of the desk until the words came. In the afternoon, he carried the rubbish to the curb and waved at Helen next door, who asked if he needed anything. And he said, "Not yet," which was true. And when the truck clattered away, he stood a moment in the driveway and watched a single maple leaf let go early and drift down like a quiet yes. And he thought that people believed change came like thunder, but more often it came like this. In small permissions you grant yourself. He went back inside and brewed tea at 4 because he always brewed tea at 4. And he took it without sugar and with a slice of lemon that he squeezed hard. And then he sat again and finished both letters. Brief and clear, no scolding, no heat, only sentences that fit on a page and said what needed saying. You asked me to find my own place. I will. Please make your plans accordingly. Love requires respect. After dinner, which he cooked and ate alone because Marcus and Isabel had gone to a tasting event, he washed the pan and wiped the stove and set the sponge where it always dried. And he took a walk around the block in his old windbreaker with the stitched initials EW, and he counted his steps like he did when he wanted to think without getting lost in thinking. 1 to 100 and back to 1. And on the last turn, he looked up at the dark shape of the maple against the late sky and thought of a different tree he had seen once near a different sea, a tree that bent in another wind, and he felt a pull in his chest that was not fear. That night, he stacked 3 empty trunks in the hallway and found the rolls of yellow tape in the laundry room and set them on the study chair. And then he sat at the desk with Eleanor's note in front of him and whispered her name once, not for comfort exactly, but as a way to steady his aim. And he slept easily because the hard part was not what to do, but beginning to do it. And he had begun. In the morning, he would call Lydia, and he would check what he already knew about deeds and signatures and what belonged to whom. And he would call a broker who knew how to speak quietly. And somewhere far away, a door would open that had been waiting years for a hand like his to turn the knob. But for now, he lay in his bed, in the house he had built with his days, and let the dark hold him like water. And he did not worry about where he would go, because he had already decided. And he did not worry about what Marcus would say because he had already heard it. And he did not worry about being old because he knew the truth that made people uncomfortable when you said it out loud. You can be old and still beginning. Edward rose before the sun and put the kettle on because beginnings felt stronger when the house was still. And he opened the red leather folder again to read each page as if it might shift in the night. Then, when the clock on the stove clicked to 7:59, he dialed his attorney, Lydia Park, and said in a steady voice that he needed her to pull the full title chain on 14 Willow Lane. Lydia did not waste words. She said, "Give me an hour. I will call you back." And in the time the kettle boiled and cooled and boiled again, Edward laid out 3 neat stacks on his desk. The trust documents he and Eleanor had signed when the first biopsy shook their calendar, the maintenance receipts no one ever asked to see, but he kept anyway, and a short letter Eleanor had written in a hotel room near a winter hospital, telling him to be brave without witnesses. At 9:06, Lydia called back, paper sounds in the background, and said the title is clean. The property remains in the Walsh family trust. You are the sole trustee. There is no recorded transfer to Marcus. And Edward closed his eyes in gratitude. He did not show and asked her to draft a trustee resolution authorizing sale. Private, quick close if possible. No assignment of proceeds to anyone but the trust. Lydia asked the question she had to ask. Are you certain? And he said, I am not angry. I am clear. And she said she would email drafts within the hour. When he hung up, he called the discreet brokerage on Oak Street that had sold 3 old houses on his road when families outgrew them and investors circled like gulls. And he asked for Evelyn, the senior agent, and told her he wanted an off-market showing schedule with pre-qualified buyers only, no sign in the lawn, no photos online. And she listened the way good agents do, then offered to come by that afternoon to walk the rooms and suggest a quiet price. Edward said yes, and after he ended the call, he took the yellow tape from the hall chair and made small flags on the few things that would go with him. The piano, Eleanor had touched last. The lake painting with its thin sheen of rain in the brushwork. 3 boxes of books he had read so often, the spines creaked like old stairs. And 2 trunks that had traveled to college and back with him and carried the smell of cedar because he lined them himself one spring. It was 10 when the landline rang a third time, the family office line he rarely used. And his manager, a careful man named Navid, said the Riviera file was current to last quarter, the staff retainer paid, the security contract in good standing, and the utilities on auto draft from the holding company. And Edward asked him to reconfirm the deed for the Monaco property. Maison Eleanor, an old Belle Epoque mansion fronting the promenade with iron balconies and a deep terrace. And Navid said the title sat with a Monaco Société Anonyme that bore the name of a hill in Wisconsin that only Edward would recognize. Then asked if he should alert Henri, the house manager, of an arrival date. Edward said not yet, then paused, then said yes. Tell him to expect me within 4 weeks, which felt like putting a pin into a map, the trip ceasing to be a dream and becoming a route. By noon, Lydia's drafts arrived. Resolution of sale, broker engagement letter, notice to beneficiaries. None, since Eleanor was gone, and Marcus was a remainder beneficiary only upon Edward's death. And Edward printed them because he trusted paper more than screens when it mattered, signed in blue ink, and set the envelopes in a clean row. He ate a simple lunch because he liked simple food when his mind was working. 2 slices of toast, a soft egg, a small apple. And he washed the plate and knife and left them to dry in a way that would have pleased Eleanor. Then walked the yard with small pruning shears and clipped dead wood from the roses so the new growth could find light. And while he worked, he rehearsed how he would keep his voice even when Marcus asked questions he would not answer. At 2, Evelyn arrived in a gray coat and soft shoes, a notebook already open, and she walked the house quietly for half an hour, touching banisters and window casings with the respect of a carpenter's daughter. Then sat with Edward at the kitchen table and set a range that made his eyebrows lift. Demand was fierce for well-kept older homes with gardens. Cash buyers were common. The right people would love the maple. And he said he preferred a couple or a family over an investor. And she nodded and named 3 clients who would meet that test. And they set the first showings for Friday with instructions to come in through the side gate to avoid neighborhood gossip. When she left, he phoned Helen next door and asked if she might hear footsteps and cars over the next week. And she said she heard everything on this street and kept nothing that wasn't hers. Then, softer, asked if he needed help. And he said he needed only her smile from the porch in the morning, which she promised. And he hung up and went back to his list. In the late afternoon, he opened a small safe behind a framed print in the study and took out a thin folder labeled Riviera Personal, which contained a key envelope, a list of Monaco contacts, and a card on heavy stock with a number he had not dialed in years. Henry's private line. And he dialed it and waited through 2 rings, and when Henry answered with the quiet warmth of someone who keeps houses like a priest keeps a chapel, Edward said bonjour with careful consonants, and then in English asked if the house could be opened fully, linens aired, windows washed, pantry stocked with simple things, coffee, bread, fruit, olive oil. And Henri said, of course, monsieur, the piano room dusted as well. And Edward felt the outline of his life sharpening in a faraway place. Evening came early, the winter light going blue, and Edward made tea at 4 as always, and sat at the desk to write the 2 letters he would leave on the kitchen island when it was time, keeping the sentences short because short words hold better under pressure. You asked me to find my own place. I have. Please make your plans accordingly. The house has been sold by the trustee. Your access ends on the date of closing. I wish you courage. Love requires respect. And when he finished, he did not sign in anger. He signed in the same steady hand he used on field trip permission slips and insurance forms for stitches. because the hand that steadies a child and the hand that steadies a boundary should be the same. After dinner, chicken, rice, green beans. He washed the pan, then pulled 2 suitcases from the hall closet and set them beside the trunks. And he folded shirts with muscle memory from army days, placed cufflinks in a small tin, slid Eleanor's piano scores into a flat box as if he were tucking her into bed. And he paused only once when he reached for a scarf she had knit in a hospital room, the yarn uneven, the pattern imperfect, the warmth perfect. And he put it on the top layer so it would be the first thing he saw when he opened the case in a new room. He slept. And at dawn, he ran his slow lap around the block in the windbreaker with EW stitched on it, counting his breath in 4s like he learned long ago. In through the nose, hold, out through the mouth, and back home he shaved. Put on a navy sweater that made him look like the man he still was. And at 9, he signed the broker documents Lydia had couriered over. Then placed a fountain pen in the place where his desk blotter had worn smooth in the shape of his hand. The showings began on Friday as promised, cars sliding in by the side gate, people speaking in low voices out of respect for a life they had not lived. And while they walked the rooms, Edward sat in the study and listened to the soft compliments a good house earns, light, solid, kind, and to the greedy measurements an investor always brings, square footage, setbacks, cap rate. And he wrote numbers beside names the way he used to keep score at Marcus's baseball games. Calm, exact, fair. By Monday morning, Evelyn called with 3 offers, and Edward stood at the window with the receiver to his ear as she read terms like a careful nurse reads medications, the investor highest but heavy with conditions, the young family brave but needing time, the older couple just under the top number, cash, 2-week close, no contingencies, and a note that said the garden feels loved. And something in Edward relaxed at that line, like a lock that has found its key. And he told Evelyn to accept the 3rd. And he phoned Lydia to set closing for 2 Fridays hence. And when he put the phone down, he did not cheer. He did not pace. He placed his palm on the oak desk and said thank you to the room, to the maple, to Eleanor, to the quiet part of himself that had waited so long to be used. That night, he carried the 2 letters to the kitchen island and set them beside a bowl of apples. And he wrote a small sticky that said, "Please eat these before the movers come." And he smiled, because even departures could feed people. And upstairs, he laid out his passport and a single leather wallet with only what he needed. And he checked his watch and knew he would sleep well again, because the plan was no longer a plan. It was a path. And tomorrow he would put his foot on it and not look back. Edward woke before the alarm and stood at the sink while the room came clear, the letters he had written the night before resting by the bowl of apples on the island, like 2 small stones that could change a river's path. And he brewed coffee and sliced toast and waited because waiting was a skill he trusted. At 7:20, Marcus came in with his phone in his hand and his mind already somewhere else. Reached for a mug, and then he saw his name in Edward's tidy hand. And the muscles in his jaw moved once as he opened the envelope and read the first line. "You asked me to find my own place, I have." And he read the next line slower. "The house has been sold by the trustee, closing in 2 weeks. Your access ends at closing. Make your plans accordingly. Love requires respect." And he looked up like a man who has misjudged a step in the dark. "Dad, what is this?" he asked. But before Edward could answer, Isabel walked in, ponytail sharp, leggings new, and she lifted the second envelope and tore it as if speed could change paper, her eyes racing, her breath short. And then she said, "No," the way people say it to stop a tide. And Edward set his coffee down and said what was true in plain order. "The trust still owns this house. I am the trustee. I have accepted a cash offer from people who love the garden. We close 2 Fridays from now at 10 o'clock. I will be gone before that. You will need to be gone as well." And he kept his voice even because fairness can sound like anger if you let it. Marcus moved first through denial into a lawyer-son argument about inheritance and intention. "It was supposed to be mine." And Edward nodded once and said, "When I die, yes, if I do not direct otherwise, but I am not dead." And the sentence sat in the kitchen with the smell of toast and coffee, simple and heavy. Isabel tried a different door. "This is cruel. We have plans. We already hired the designer. We have a delivery window." And Edward said, "I hope your plans are flexible. My timeline is not." And he slid a single page across the island. Lydia's trustee resolution with blue ink signatures and the closing date circled, because sometimes a signature is kinder than a speech. After breakfast, he put on his coat and met Evelyn at the curb for a pre-closing walkthrough with the buyers, the couple in their 50s who had held hands in his garden. And they stepped through each room without greed. The woman touching the window trim the way you smooth a child's hair. The man asking if the maple needed deep watering in August. And Edward handed them a small notebook he had written the night before called House Notes, with pages about the furnace filter size, the piano tuner's number, and a hand-drawn map of the roses with their real names, not the catalog names. And when they reached the back door, the woman said, "We will keep this the way you meant it." And Edward said, "Keep it the way you mean it," and put the keys back in his pocket because they were still his until the wire cleared. On the way home, he stopped by the storage company to sign the export forms for the trunks and piano, the clerk stamping each page in a rhythm that felt like a train starting. And he called Navid from the parking lot to confirm the cargo ship schedule and the receiving warehouse in Nice. And Navid said, "All set, sir, insurance confirmed," and then hesitated and added, "The latest valuation letter arrived for Maison Eleonore, insured replacement at 200 million. Do you wish me to file it?" And Edward said, "Yes, file it," and ended the call without looking back at the number because he did not live by numbers, even when they were large. Back at the house, he found boxes by the door just as he had expected. Not his boxes, theirs. A stack flattened and brand new. The cardboard smell of a sudden plan. And he heard drawers opening and the quick movements people make when they finally believe the clock. And he walked to the study and closed the door and called Henry and said, "The date is set." And Henry said, "We will open the shutters tomorrow and lay out fresh linens. The sea is very calm this week." And Edward closed his eyes at the picture and said thank you. Then booked his flight for the morning after closing. Aisle seat, first flight out, because early starts had always favored him. The days bent into a steady line. The appraiser came and went. The title company courier arrived with a stack of forms and left with signatures. The gardener trimmed the hedge one last time for him and shook his hand in the driveway and said, "She looks strong," meaning the maple, and Edward said, "She is." And when the movers arrived to crate the piano, the foreman wrapped the legs with the care of a medic and slid the fallboard down as gently as a good night. And Edward labeled the books to music room, as if the room already existed in another country, which it did. He kept his routine but shortened it. Tea at 4, a small walk at dusk, a call to Helen to thank her for keeping her porch light warm, and each night he placed one more thing into the suitcase. Not because he needed it, but because choosing is a way to practice leaving. 3 nights before closing, Marcus knocked on the study door and stepped in without waiting. A habit that had always been forgiven, and stood with his hands in his pockets like a boy who wants to say he is sorry but has picked the wrong words. And he tried again, a negotiation this time. "Stay in the carriage house for a month. We'll Airbnb something. It will give us time." And Edward shook his head and kept his face kind. "The boundary is the gift, Marcus. If I blur it now, you will think I did not mean it." And Marcus swallowed and nodded and left, because some sentences end a room. 2 nights before closing, Isabel asked for a copy of the trust because her lawyer wanted to review options, and Edward handed her a clean copy and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that paper could not. And he went upstairs and sat in the dark bedroom and felt the house breathe, old wood, clean paint, winter air moving at the edges of windows. And he said out loud, "Thank you," again, and put his palm to the wall and felt it answer in the way houses do, not with sound, but with the way a line of days can hold a man together. On the morning of closing, he wore the navy sweater Eleanor had said made his eyes look like a lake in shade, and he signed at the title office without rushing. The buyers across the table passing their cashier's check like a token in an old story. And when the wire confirmation appeared on Lydia's screen, she nodded once and slid the keys to the new owners, and the woman put them in her purse the way you place a ring you intend to wear for life. Outside, the air felt soft, and Edward walked home along the long way, past the bakery where they still knew his order, past the corner where he had once taught Marcus to ride a bike by holding the seat exactly long enough and then letting go. And when he turned onto his street, he saw 2 cars in his driveway, and a pile of new boxes by the door, and a delivery van idling at the curb. And he did not step into the stream of their morning. He went to the side gate, took one last look at the maple, and left the buyer's welcome basket on the stoop with a note that said, "For your first night, bread, jam, and the piano tuner's card." And then he walked to the curb where the taxi he had scheduled was already waiting with its trunk open like a simple mouth. And he put his suitcases inside and closed the lid and sat in the back seat and watched the house shrink as the driver pulled away, feeling no triumph, only the exact relief that comes when a bridge holds. At the airport, he texted Marcus a single line. "The keys belong to the Hendersons now. I wish you courage." And turned his phone to silent, not as punishment, but as protection for the first hours of a new life. And when the plane lifted and the town slid into geometry beneath clouds, he rested his head against the window and let the old mystery of going somewhere on purpose fill his chest. The knowledge that he had always been more than the role other people needed from him, and that at last he was living like a man who remembered it. Edward landed in Nice just after dawn, and moved with the steady rhythm of a man who had practiced leaving, passport checked, small suitcase in hand, a folded list in his pocket with 4 lines: car, keys, bread, call Henry. And when the driver steered the sedan onto the coastal road, the sea slid beside them like a calm animal, and the light came up in clean steps. Monaco rose ahead, neat and bright, and the car turned onto Avenue Princess Grace, where the iron gates of Maison Eleonore opened at a touch from the guard. And Edward stepped out into a courtyard that smelled faintly of salt and citrus and new linen. And Henri was already at the base of the steps in a dark jacket, the kind of man who knows how to make a house speak quietly. "Welcome home, Monsieur Walsh," he said in careful English, and Edward nodded and said, "Thank you, Henry." The words simple and exact because he meant them. Inside, the shutters were open, and the tall windows lifted the morning in like a tide. Marble floors cool underfoot. A staircase curled to the second floor in an easy line, and staff moved with soft shoes. Marina, the housekeeper, who had aired the bedrooms and left a small vase of white flowers on the writing desk. Paolo, the chef, who asked without fuss about breakfast and learned in a sentence that Edward liked eggs soft and bread plain. And Luke, the gardener, who stood with a cap in his hands and, when asked, said the roses were older than any of them, but still willing. Henri set a leather wallet of keys on the entry table and showed Edward each room in order so that nothing felt strange. Music room at the front, empty corner, waiting for the piano. Library with glass front shelves and a ladder that slid on a rail. Study with a single locked drawer that Henri said held documents from the first inventory. Dining room with a door that swung to the pantry where Paolo had placed olive oil, salt, lemons, and coffee without label. Edward listened, looked, and said little, the way he had learned to do when the world tried to hurry him. He touched the window latch to feel the weight. He checked the hinge on a door and smiled, because good hinges do not squeak. He stepped onto the terrace and stood in the light long enough to set his breathing to the same measure as the water. And when Henri asked about luggage, Edward said the trunks and piano would arrive by sea, and that he had brought only what he needed for a week, because he liked to prove to himself that most things are not necessary. After a simple breakfast, 2 eggs, bread, coffee, he unpacked his suitcase alone, shirts in the top drawer, Eleanor's scarf folded on the chair where the light fell warm at 11 in the morning, his fountain pen and small notebook set on the writing desk with the spine square to the edge because straight lines calmed him. And then he took the small red leather folder from the bag and placed it in the study safe behind a panel. Henri showed him, the click of the lock steady as a heartbeat. By late morning, he walked down to the market at La Condamine, one step after another. No rush, the promenade filling with people who did not stare because they did not need to. And at the first stall, he bought oranges. At the second, he bought tomatoes. And at the third, he tried his French and was answered with patience, the vowels corrected with a smile, and he carried the bag home himself because the weight felt good. After lunch, he sat with Henri in the study to go through practical matters: mail, security, delivery schedules. And Henri slid a small envelope across the desk with a label from years ago in a house manager's tidy hand. From initial preparation, kept per instruction. And inside, Edward found a key with a tag stamped A, the letter Eleanor had signed cards with when she was playful, and a folded note in his own writing from long ago. For when we arrived together, he read the line, set the paper down, and did not move for a breath because something in the room shifted without sound. A door inside him, perhaps, that remembered the spring that did not come, and he said to Henri, "Please leave me an hour." And when the room was empty, he found the locked drawer Henri had mentioned, turned the key, and opened it. There was no treasure, only a thin stack of items packed with care. Eleanor's penciled sheet music for Claire de Lune, a photo of the two of them at the lake under a gray sky, and a second note in Eleanor's round hand that matched the one in the red folder. "If they forget who you are, play this." And he smiled, because she had always known how to point him to the thing that would stead him. In the afternoon, Luc walked him through the garden behind the house, along a path of pale stone, palms on one side, and a line of old roses on the other. Names written on small tags: Souvenir de la Malmaison, Gloire de Dijon, Isaac Pereire. And Edward asked how the wind came from the sea in winter, and whether the soil needed loosening or restraint, and Luc answered with a craftsman's plain words. And the two men made a plan to prune the canes next week at dawn while the light was still kind, and when they reached the far wall, Edward touched the rough stone and thought of the maple at home, then corrected himself. At the house that was no longer his, and he felt no pull to turn around. Toward evening, Paolo set a plate of grilled fish and a small salad on the terrace and left without hovering. And Edward ate slowly, watched the color change along the water, and took out his phone only once to send a single message to Navid. Arrived. All well. And saw, stacked below a short line from his manager, 3 messages from Marcus and 2 from Isabel, the subject lines a mix of panic and demand, and he put the phone face down and finished his meal, because some things can wait until they cannot, and he would choose the time. After dinner, he walked the rooms again, this time with lamps on and windows open, and the house sounded like a house should at night. Soft air, no rattle, the faint hiss of the sea like breath at the edge of sleep. And in the music room, he set Eleanor's sheet music on the stand of a loaner keyboard. Paolo had brought up from a storage room until the piano arrived, and he played the first bars slowly. Left hand simple, right hand careful, the notes clear but not showy, and the room answered with a clean echo that held and then let go. And for a moment he felt exactly the age he was, not young, not old, only the right size for the place he occupied. When Henri knocked once and stepped in to set the alarm code for the night, Edward asked about a weekly reading group he had seen in a note. And Henri said, Madame Dubois in the building next door hosted one on Thursdays, and he wrote the time in the small notebook because he liked to put new things where he could see them. And then he took the elevator to the second floor like a guest, made the bed turn down with his own hands because he did not like to be fussy, and stood at the window of the bedroom while the city thinned to quiet. Before he slept, he opened his notebook and wrote the day in lines. Landed, keys, bread, note in drawer, roses, first bars, sea steady. And he added at the bottom one sentence that would be true tomorrow as well. Boundary held, grace intact. And he closed the book and set it square, and when the phone buzzed again on the nightstand, he turned it face down without checking, because the house was teaching him the right order for things. Rest first, then answers. And he switched off the lamp and lay listening to the low sound of water on stone and thought, without drama and without apology, that he had found the place he had been moving toward for years, and that the mystery now was not whether he could live here, but what this life would teach him to become. Edward woke to pale light on the ceiling and the soft sound of waves against stone, and he began the new day the way he began all steady days, with a short list in his pocket. Piano delivery, market, meet Madame Dubois, write to Helen. And after coffee, he walked the rooms again so his feet would learn the turns without thinking. At 9, Henri brought a thin folder of contacts and a delivery window from the shipping company. "Your trunks and the instrument reach nice tomorrow, sir." And Edward nodded and asked only whether the movers knew to set the piano in the front music room where the morning sun found the floor at 10. Then he went down to La Condamine, carrying a cloth bag because he liked carrying his own things. And he bought oranges that felt heavy for their size, a loaf still warm, and a small wedge of cheese the shopkeeper recommended with patient French he could almost follow. And he walked home on the seaside of the street because he wanted the wind on his face. In the afternoon, he rang the bell at the neighboring building and introduced himself to Madame Dubois, who opened her door with books in one arm and glasses on a chain and said, "Thursday at 4, bring a poem or a page." And he promised he would. And on the way back, he paused in the garden to look at the roses with Luc and learned their names, the way you learn names of people you hope to see again. That evening, he ate a simple plate of fish. Paolo sat on the terrace, turned his phone face down when it buzzed, and wrote in his notebook the events of the day in short lines so they would hold: market, neighbor, wind. And then he slept with the window cracked because he liked air that moved. The next morning, a van from the shipping agent backed through the gates. 2 men in canvas aprons lifted crates with care. And the piano arrived swaddled like a grand old thing, the foreman touching the corners with a carpenter's worry. And Edward stood near the doorway and only said, "Thank you," when the instrument's legs were bolted on and the fallboard slid up and the room changed in the way rooms change when the right object finds its place. The bench, wrapped in its own blanket, came last, and when Edward lifted the lid, he found the rolls of staff paper he had packed himself, and, tucked flat at the bottom, an old envelope he had forgotten he had ever written, in his own hand from a winter 5 years ago, when he believed Eleanor would live to see spring. For Monaco. And when he slipped a finger under the flap, the paper opened without tearing, and inside lay a single page of Eleanor's music in pencil and a faint line in her round script. "Play this where the sea can hear." And he sat down and placed the page on the stand and laid his hands on the keys that had waded through miles and customs and stairs. And he played the simple melody she had sketched, left hand a small tide, right hand a thin thread of light. And the sound went out through the tall windows and came back soft. And when he finished, he kept his hands on the keys for 1 heartbeat longer, because endings deserve a breath. When the tuner arrived at noon and worked his measured way across the strings, Edward let the small talk sit and asked only for a card and a date 2 weeks hence. And then he carried his trunks upstairs and put shirts in drawers, books on shelves, and a scarf on the chair by the window where the light would find it. And when he returned to the music room, he saw for the first time a small brass escutcheon on the lower cabinet door. An old keyhole he had not noticed in yesterday's bright, the shape stamped with a tiny raised letter, A. And he remembered the slim key Henri had given him from the drawer labeled "Kept per instruction." And he took it from his pocket and turned it once. And the cabinet door opened on oiled hinges to reveal a shallow interior with 3 objects laid in a careful order. A leather portfolio stamped with the same letter, a photograph of the house taken from the promenade in early morning light, and a note on heavy paper in a house manager's neat hand from years ago. Per Monsieur's request, when the house was purchased, documents to be given upon first opening of the music cabinet. Edward lifted the portfolio and found inside a draft charter with the title Fondation Eleanor, Music and Sea, with sections in French and English and small pencil marks in the margins where his younger hand had once asked questions about scholarships and shoreline care and what it meant to keep a place useful after you are no longer in it. And the sight of his own old marks felt like a stranger waving across a street and also like being seen. And he read to the end and stood very still because the plan he had made in grief and then sealed had been waiting for him like a task at the right time. In the afternoon, after the movers left and the house was quiet again, Henri brought tea and said without pressing, "Is there anything more you require?" And Edward said, "Not more, just the right next." and he asked Henri to schedule a meeting with a notaire for the following week to review the foundation papers and update what the years had changed. And Henri nodded, already making a list on a small card only he could read. That night, when his phone lit with messages in a stubborn sequence. Marcus first, then Isabelle, then Marcus again. Edward let the screen go dark and put the device in the drawer, and he wrote 2 short postcards instead, one to Helen. Arrived safely. Roses here have old names. The sea sounds like the wind in our maple. I will write more soon. And one to the couple who had bought his house, sent care of the agent. If the kitchen drawer sticks, lift the right side and it will slide. The herb bed likes compost in March. Thank you for loving the garden. And when he sealed them, he felt the clean relief that comes from sending a small kindness to the right address. On Thursday, he took a folded poem he had copied long ago into his notebook and climbed the stairs to Madame Dubois' apartment, where 6 people sat with tea and a plate of biscuits and read paragraphs aloud in 3 languages. And when it was his turn, he read slowly and did not try to make his voice do anything fancy. And afterward, the group talked about sentences that hold under weather. And a woman named Sarah, who used to be an accountant, said she had started sculpting. And a man named Jean-Claude, who used to be a banker, said he ran a small bistro now that made only 4 dishes and all of them well. And Edward listened and thought about how people can begin again not by pretending to be new, but by using the old parts properly. The days made a rhythm. Market in the morning, work with Luke on the roses before the sun grew strong, piano after lunch, a walk along Larvoto when shadows lengthened, and he let the rhythm teach him where to stand and where to sit. And he did not open the messages, but he did not fear them either. And he made one practical appointment each day, so the larger change would be built of small, exact bricks. The bank to confirm international access, the notaire to set a review date, the tuner to return, the doctor for a checkup that left him with a clear bill and a printed list of French words for aches he did not have. One afternoon, going through the study drawers to make them his without making a mess of their history, he found a thin envelope with Eleanor's initials on the corner and nothing inside, which made him smile, because sometimes the sign is the envelope itself, a reminder to keep the inside for yourself. And he set it on the desk as a kind of bookmark for the day. On Sunday, he called the family office and spoke to Navid and said, "We will activate the foundation file." And he could hear the care in the way Navid wrote down each word. And after the call, he took the portfolio to the terrace and read the clauses again. And in the margin next to a sentence about scholarships, he added a line in his steady hand. "For people who begin late and mean it." And that night, with the window open and the room full of air that smelled faintly of salt and stone, he finally scrolled through Marcus's messages in order: anger, then bargaining, then something like fear. And he set the phone down without answering, because answers given too early can weaken a lesson. And he wrote one line in his notebook that would not change tomorrow: hold the boundary until it teaches. And he slept, and in his sleep, he did not dream of the old house or of being told to move. He dreamed only of a key with a small raised letter, a cabinet that opened at the right turn, and a melody simple enough for the sea to remember. Edward let 3 more quiet mornings pass before he returned any calls, because he had learned that time is a tool. And on the 4th morning, he woke to low light and the smell of coffee and the steady breath of the sea through the open window. And he decided it was the right day to listen. He carried his cup to the terrace, sat where he could see the harbor and the pale line of Larvoto, and scrolled through messages in order until the first one that was not demanding but asking appeared, and he pressed call. The ringtone traveled across an ocean and stopped with a scrape of breath on the other end, and Marcus said, "Dad?" in a smaller voice than his money usually gave him. And Edward said, "I'm here," and waited. Marcus began with apology, the way a man who has rehearsed it begins. A little too fast at first, then slower, then honest. And he said he had spoken to a lawyer, that the trust papers were clear, that he had no claim on a house he had treated like a right. And then he said the part that sounded new: "I told you to find your own place as if you were a task, not a person." And Edward said, "Yes," and let the one word sit because it was enough. The sea made a soft hiss against the stones below. The gulls turned in the same circles they always turned, and Marcus kept talking, said Isabel had moved out a month after closing, said she had not liked the shift from designer installs and club tables to a rented apartment near Riverside, said he had learned what a refrigerator costs when you're the one paying for the coils, said he had learned that eating at home grows a different patience, and then quieter, said he did not understand how he had become a man who could speak to his father about activities and meal plans. As if care were a brochure, Edward listened and did not rush to comfort, because comfort given too soon can make a lesson fade, and when Marcus asked if he might visit, not to move anything, not to ask for anything, but to see where his father had gone and to hear what he was like when he was not under anyone's thumb, Edward said he could, with one condition, and he made the condition simple so that it would hold. Come when you can be humble. And the phone was quiet for a beat, and then Marcus let out a sound that might have been a short laugh and also might have been a small sob. And he said, "I will try." And Edward said, "Trying is a beginning," and told him to send his dates to Henry, who could arrange a room nearby that was decent but not show, because learning sits better in simple rooms. After the call, Edward wrote 3 lines in his small notebook. Call made, conditions set, wait. And he closed the cover and went downstairs, where Henri had laid a folder on the entry table with a notaire's card clipped to the front. The meeting was at 11 in a small office above a bookshop on Rue Grimaldi, and the notaire, a woman with calm eyes and a clean desk, rose and shook his hand and asked in clear French if he wished to review the old charter or build a new one. And Edward said both, and she laid the draft of Fondation Eleanor, music and C between them, and slid a pencil across so he could mark what his eye caught. And they went clause by clause in plain words: purpose, governance, seat, assets, use. And when they reached the line that would transfer the Monaco house from the holding company to the foundation with a lifetime right of use for Edward, he felt the lines inside him fall into place like stones in a good wall. And he asked 3 questions about stewardship and a 4th about how to make the house work when he no longer could, and the notaire answered each without hurry. Then turned the page to a section he had added in the margin with his own hand the night before. Scholarships, for people who begin late and mean it. And she smiled and said those words had a strong spine. She asked for beneficiaries by type, not by name, and he said musicians who have never had a proper instrument, and caretakers of small shorelines where human hands can still help the sea breathe. And she wrote exactly that, because good papers should sound like the person who will carry them. When he signed the preliminary minutes, she placed the pen down in a straight line and said there would be filings and stamps and perhaps a week of patient waiting. And Edward said he had practice with patience, and when he stepped back into the bookshop air, he bought 2 postcards of the harbor and a thin paperback of poems he might read at Madame Dubois's next Thursday. And he walked home the long way so the news could settle inside him at the same pace as his feet. Luc was in the garden when he returned, hat low, hands sure on the shears, and together they cut the first tired blooms and tied new canes to a simple wire, and Luc said the wind would shift tomorrow and bring a different air, and Edward nodded because that was true in more than one way. At 4 he made tea for himself and for Henri, and carried 2 cups to the music room where the piano sat with its lid open like a small black boat. And he told Henri in a few sentences about the foundation. And Henri listened the way houses listen, with an attention that has nothing to do with rush, and said only, Madame Eleanor would approve, and Edward felt his throat catch once and clear. At dusk, he opened his phone because he had chosen that hour for answers and not before, and he typed a short message to Marcus with dates that would work and the address of a modest hotel 2 streets back from the sea, and he added no lecture and no advice, only pack light, because that is a kindness too. The next morning, the notaire sent a list of documents to sign and a draft deed of transfer that would move Maison Eleanor into the foundation, the way a good boat slides into its right water. And Edward read every line at the long table by the open window, line by line, not because he distrusted anyone, but because reading is a way to be present for your own life. At noon, the tuner returned and brought the bass into focus until the room felt like a chest filled with a calm heart. And Edward played the piece with Eleanor's pencil marks again. Then something older his fingers remembered without asking his mind. And the sound went out to the terrace and the stones and the water. And he thought for a moment that the sea truly could hear. Late that afternoon, he answered a message from Helen at last. Told her about the roses with their old names, told her about the music group and the notaire and the way the city watched the light like a useful thing. And she wrote back one line, "Keep your back tall," which had been her way of saying be yourself since the year Eleanor got sick. And he wrote, "Always," and felt steadier. 2 days later, Marcus arrived. Late flight, black carry-on, no entourage. Eyes a little red at the edges, the way eyes get when someone has been working and thinking at the same time. And Henri walked him to the modest room with a small balcony that saw the sea only if you leaned a little. And in the morning, Edward met him at the corner bakery, and they sat on a bench and ate warm bread from paper and watched runners pass. And Marcus told him without drama that he had sold a second home he did not need and closed a venture fund he had opened to impress the wrong people. And he said he was seeing a therapist once a week to learn how to speak to a parent like a person. And he laughed once when he said it because the sentence felt like a riddle in a map. And Edward nodded and said, "Good," and they walked the promenade slowly and stopped to look at a white dog point its nose at the wind. And Edward noticed that Marcus did not fill every silence with words, which meant learning had begun. They visited the market where Edward bought oranges, and Marcus carried them without being asked. And in the music room, Edward played the small melody and did not tell the story until Marcus asked. And when he told it, he kept to the facts: pencil, envelope, winter that did not end, house that waited. And Marcus listened and did not interrupt. And when they reached the part about the foundation, he did not ask for a seat or a role. He said only, "That is right," and Edward believed him. In the afternoon, they met the notaire, and she explained with the same calm voice how the deed would pass and how the law would hold it. And Marcus read and asked 2 good questions about governance that proved he had read. And then he put the pen down and said, "This house should work after us." And Edward felt something old unclench. That evening, they ate at a small bistro where the owner cooked exactly 4 dishes, and all of them well. And they spoke about simple things: how to cut roses without hurting them, how to tell when a foundation clause is clear, how to carry a boundary without turning it into a wall. And when they parted at the corner, Marcus reached for a handshake and then did something he had not done in years. He hesitated and then hugged his father the way a grown man hugs when he means it, short and strong, and said, "Thank you for not teaching me with shouting." And Edward said, "Thank you for arriving with your hands open," and walked home under a sky that looked the same as the first night and not the same at all. Before he slept, he wrote 1 sentence in his notebook that would carry into the next day. "When the door opens, step through, but keep the key." And he slipped the small key with the raised letter back into his pocket, because some mysteries are not solved, they are kept, to remind you who you are when someone forgets. Edward woke before first light on the day the deed would pass, and he stood at the bedroom window until the black softened to gray, and the sea began its steady breathing in the open air. And he told himself the order of the hours, so nothing would lean. Breakfast, notaire at 10, bank at 11, signatures at noon, a walk after. And then the reading group with Madame Dubois, where he would bring a short poem about keys. He shaved, put on the navy jacket. Eleanor always said made him look exact, and ate bread and fruit at the small kitchen table because he liked to begin important days with simple food. And at 9:30, he walked down Rue Grimaldi with Marcus at his side, the 2 of them not talking much, not from coldness, but because some mornings do not need words. The notaire greeted them in her office above the bookshop, opened the file she had built with neat tabs, and placed the deed, the foundation charter, and the minutes in a clean line on the desk. And Edward read each page again, not to find a trick, but to keep his promises with his eyes as well as his name. Then he signed slowly where the blue tabs asked, Walsh, Edward L., trustee. Walsh, Edward L., founder. and the notaire watched each stroke the way a captain watches a rope hold. And when she lifted the documents and slid them into a folio, she said in clear English, "The house now belongs to Fondation Eleanor, Music and Sea, with your lifetime right of use." And Marcus let out a breath, as if something he had been holding behind his ribs had finally set down. At the bank, the transfer of the holding company's share certificate took 10 minutes and 2 stamps. Then they walked back through the narrow streets and up the steps to Maison Eleanor, where Henry stood in the entry and took the folio with careful hands and placed it in the safe behind the panel. Edward knew now as well as his own pocket, and the soft click of the lock felt like the moment a song finds its last note. At lunch, Paolo made a small pasta with tomatoes and basil, and the 3 men ate at the kitchen table because kitchens make people honest. And after, Marcus stood by the music room windows and said he had a flight that evening, an early meeting tomorrow, and therapy on Thursday at noon. And he said all these things without apology, as if saying them in order would keep them steady. And he added, almost as an aside, that he had moved into a small place near a park, no view, but good light by the table in the morning. And Edward said, "Good," because he meant it. And because good light by a table is a thing that saves more days than people think. At the door, Marcus reached for a handshake and then pulled his father into a short, strong hug like the one the week before. And he did not promise to come back soon, and he did not ask for a role in the foundation, and he did not ask for money. He said only, "I will write." And when he left, Henry stood in the doorway until the street turned him from a person into the shape of a person, which is what streets do, and then closed the door and let the house go quiet. Edward sat alone in the music room and put his hands on the piano and did not play yet. He listened to the house breathe, the faint shift of air through the high windows, the distant tires on the promenade, the sound of water on stone, and after a little while, he opened the brass-faced cabinet with the key marked by the small raised A, and took out the leather portfolio one more time, and read the line he had written in the margin weeks earlier. "For people who begin late and mean it." And he smiled, because he could already see 3 names for the first year. A woman in Lyon who tuned pianos at night and played them in secret in the day. A retired dock worker from Marseille who wrote songs in a notebook stained with oil. And a caretaker group in a small cove east of here that pulled plastic from the shore until their hands shook. And he wrote their names in his small notebook with a box beside each that he would fill when the notaire said, "Approved." In the late afternoon, he walked to the post office to mail a letter to Helen with 2 photographs tucked inside. Care, the terrace with the sea soft behind it, and a rose labeled "Souvenir de la Malmaison." And he wrote on the back of the second photo, "The names are old, the flowers are new." And at the counter, he bought a sheet of stamps with tiny boats and placed one on the corner with a care he hoped the letter would feel. On Thursday, he carried a folded poem to Madame Dubois' apartment, read it slowly to the group when it was his turn, and listened while Sarah the sculptor spoke about weight and balance, and how adding clay in one place means taking it from another. And he thought, that is what a boundary is. And he wrote the sentence in his notebook. The next week, a package arrived at the front desk, forwarded by Evelyn, brown paper, careful hand. And inside, he found a letter from Carol Henderson, the woman who had bought his house, and a dozen photos. His old kitchen with fresh paint and the drawer fixed, the maple at dusk, the first climbing roses blooming near the fence, and in one picture a small chalkboard on the pantry door where someone had written, "House Notes by Mr. Walsh, kept." And he sat down in the entry chair to look at each picture twice, and when he was done, he wrote back and said thank you for loving the garden, and told her the herb bed would like compost in March and again in September. And he added a small drawing of the way the rosemary likes to lean to the window. The foundation papers cleared the ministry the following Monday, and the notaire sent a short note with a stamp that made Henri smile. And Henri brought a tray to the music room with a pen, a single page to sign for the bank account, and a small brass seal in a blue box, A surrounded by a ring of waves. And when Edward pressed the seal into the warm wax on the first grant letter and lifted it away, the mark looked like something Eleanor would have approved with her eyes and her mouth both. He sent 3 letters that day. One to the woman in Lyon with a voucher for a year of lessons and a piano rental. One to the dock worker with a certificate for studio time and a good guitar. And one to the Cove group with funds for bags, gloves, and a stipend for the woman who always stayed last to sweep pebbles back to where the sea liked them. And he placed each sealed envelope on the entry table and watched Henri carry them to the box as if he were carrying small birds that needed a steady hand. Life made a rhythm again. Market in the morning, work with Luc while the light was kind. A call with the notaire when a clause needed a comma, not a semicolon. Piano after lunch, a walk along Larvato toward evening, and the reading group on Thursdays where he learned that people who begin late tell better jokes. A week after Marcus left, a postcard arrived from Atlanta with a picture of trees along a street Edward had never walked, and the short message on the back made him sit down on the bench outside the bakery. "Dad, the light at my table at 8 a.m. is good. The park has geese that refuse to be impressed. My therapist says beginning late is still beginning. Thank you for the boundary." M. And Edward wrote on the edge of the card with his pen in small letters, "Pack light?" Then laughed because it was already sent and bought a second coffee and carried the postcard home. In late spring, Madame Dubois knocked on his door with a thin book and an invitation to speak for 5 minutes at the salon on the theme of belonging. And he stood in his music room with the door open to the sea and practiced a small speech he did not memorize. And on the night he spoke, he kept it plain. He said, "A house does not belong to you because your name is on a paper. It belongs to you because you keep it working and you let it work after you. And belonging is not ownership. It is stewardship, which is a longer word for care." And when he sat down, the room was quiet. The way rooms are when a simple sentence hits the wall and comes back with the shape of a bell. One morning, a storm moved in from the east, and the wind pushed hard at the palms, and the sea threw itself against the stones, and the house held. And as the windows rattled softly, Henri appeared with a small tin box he had found behind a panel in a closet on the 3rd floor while checking shutters, the tin stamped with the faint same A as the cabinet, and inside lay a dry sprig of rosemary wrapped in tissue, a seashell with a clean hole through its top, and a slip of paper in Eleanor's round hand. For the day the sea shouts, boil water, breathe, and play. And Edward boiled water, breathed, and played the small melody that had crossed an ocean, and the storm went on, and then eased because storms do that. And he felt not protected by magic, but steadied by practice, which to him had always felt like the right kind of mystery. In the first summer of the foundation, letters arrived with shaky handwriting and strong voices. A woman wrote she had touched a real piano for the first time at 61 and found her left hand stubborn but willing. The dock worker sent a link to a song that sounded like work done well. The Cove group sent a picture of bags stacked like low hills and a clean line of shore. And Edward pinned each note to a corkboard in the study and looked at it before he set the piano lid down at night. Sometimes Marcus called from airports, and sometimes he did not. And when he did, they spoke as if they were men who had learned to carry their own weight and could now offer a hand without leaning. And once, in the fall, Marcus stood again in the foyer and did not look past his father to the rooms. He looked at his father's face instead, and they walked down to the market and back, carrying oranges that felt heavy for their size. And the city kept breathing, and the house kept working, and the sea kept saying what seas say when people are quiet long enough to hear it. On his 70th birthday, Edward wrote one more sentence in his small notebook, not for anyone else but himself. "I did not move to be far. I moved to be true." And he set the notebook square to the edge of the desk and slid the key with the raised letter into his pocket. And he went to the terrace where the morning light collected on the railing like a held breath. And he played Eleanor's page once, then something new his hands had learned, and he thought, with no drama at all, that beginnings are not loud, they are steady, and the mystery is not how to start, it is how to keep going with grace.